security, the nature of the macro labor market, the job opportunities for women. So all of those things are continuing to remain, but certainly paid domestic work is not being leveraged to increase women's labor force participation, which is something that we are able to see in the data and should give us a moment of pause. The other part is to really argue that future study on domestic work needs to start looking at low-income households not as suppliers of labor, but also employers. We need to understand why these households are hiring paid domestic work, what the net gains are for what activities, and how this shapes those dynamics around caste and gender, especially in urban areas. We also need to understand the particular patterns of paid domestic work within high-income households. The fact that elite high-income households in Bangalore do not give more than 67% of hours for food preparation to paid domestic workers indicates to us very clearly non-market factors around who can cook, who can access the kitchen, coming out of norms of caste, gender in labor that are very important to understand. In Chennai, we don't see this. We see an 89% handover to paid domestic workers, but there are clearly demarcations we need to understand better. And therefore, our assumption that metropolitan dynamics are deeply important in understanding domestic work. There seem to be differences at the city scale in how markets and labor work. And this will become actually clearer as we move to our second report, which is actually about the quality of employment of domestic work itself. And I'll ask my colleague Rashi to take us into that report.
So the second report of our study is Deficits in Decent Work, which are employer perspectives and practices on the quality of employment and domestic work in urban India. For this second report, our sample was of 3,067 households across Bangalore and Chennai. Again, we continue to divide it across 3 income groups. And as has already been said by Gautam, that of course a majority of the employers were from the high income and the middle income households. There is still a 10% movement within the low income households as employers as well. So in this study, we looked at what does quality of employment mean. And for this, we drew from different frameworks, such as the UNEC, ILO frameworks, and ILO's conceptualization of decent work, and the NCUS framework. Drawing from across these 3 frameworks, we looked at the following. So we looked at recruitment, so recruitment channels, recruitment checks and verifications, preferences and parameters for decisions on recruitment, etc. Income security, wages paid, basis of determining these wages, bonus and increments paid, basis of determining bonus and increments. Employment and work security, so terms of employment of termination, terms of assistance in case of illness or injury at work, and social security, which is terms of paid leave, terms of medical insurance or equality, maternity entitlements, maternity leave, and terms of employment in cases of pregnancy and childbirth. So we also looked at the majority of the workers were live-out part-time workers in our study. The key findings that we have from our report are that why are employers hiring? And we found that people are hiring to free up more time for care work. Like it's been said that it's fewer where people are, employers are getting into paid work, but it's freeing up time to take on even more care work. So that's about 35% in Bangalore, 40% in Chennai. And to free up time for paid work, it's still incredibly low. It's 13.5 in Bangalore, further lower in Chennai, it's 8.5%. And that the way that the hiring is happening is thickly spatial, and it's a very social market, which means that people are hiring workers from the neighborhood recruitment channels. So 67% in Bangalore hired from within the neighborhood, so which means that, neighboring houses or even previous owners or renters of the same apartment are disproportionately important in hiring, in how hiring takes place. Caste, we found, was a hiring factor that was critical. 25% of high-income households in Bangalore said that caste was very important when they hired a worker, as compared to only 14% that said that that was not the case. Chennai is fared much better and said, like, if you could see the blues there. So in Chennai, caste didn't matter as much, so in your city, but there's also a history of social movement around caste, and both cities' histories are very different there, so that could also be one of the reasons why this is coming up.
Just take the scale point, that scale point.
Yeah. And the other important things are that we found were that skill was not as valued. So traits and attributes matter more. So attributes such as loyalty and trust matter more, because this is still being considered as a very unskilled form of work for the employers.
So what we're finding actually in domestic work, just before I give you the wage arguments, is two clear reasons. One is that the findings of report 1, that paid domestic work is not being leveraged to take on wage work, shows up because when we ask employers, why are you hiring? Very few of them say we're hiring because we have to go to work. Most of them are hiring for care work within the home. The second part is that this description of the neighborhood being disproportionately important. So the term we're using is to say that domestic work is both a thickly spatial and a thickly social labor market. So when the neighborhood becomes the main spatial point of hiring, it effectively means that domestic workers are being hired on the basis of reputation and referral in a very small spatial area. They are working with the neighbors' homes or within the same home, and then reputation is deeply shaping their ability to collectively organize as workers. Because instead of thinking of, for example, construction workers who can organize against a contractor, you're thinking of domestic workers knowing that if they have a bad relationship with one employer, are basically ruining the entire labor market they have in the entire neighborhood, because all their hiring is happening through referral and reputation. The second main point that's very important is there is a general perception in employers that domestic work is unskilled. Skills are simply not referred to in what they look for in domestic workers, and it is personality traits that again make reputation deeply important. This then has direct bearing on wages. The wages are not being paid, even though government regulations see domestic work as skilled work. In the perception of employers, there is not this notion. So how much did we find the wages are? For many, we can see why it's attractive. In both cities, for the first 30% of workers, they earn 5,000 and above in each household. This compares very favorably to other informal work sectors in particular. The challenge is that the majority of the workers, which is the bottom 50% of the distribution, earn deeply inadequately. Now, there's a challenge in reporting wages for domestic workers because they make different amounts of money at different households, and their total earning is added up across work in 3 to 6 households. Employers also feel this. Many employers report, as you'll see in later reports, that actually they think domestic workers make a lot of money because they think that they're making money in multiple households. So the part-time live-out nature of urban domestic work has fractured a wage calculation. Now, Tamil Nadu and Karnataka both have specific minimum wages for domestic workers. So we asked the question a different way. We said, for the bottom 30% of workers, how many households would they have to work in to make minimum wage? Just to make minimum wage. In Karnataka, the bottom 30% would have to work in 4 households. The bottom 10% of workers would have to work in 6 households to make minimum wage. In Tamil Nadu, this was 4 in the bottom 30% and 8 households for the bottom 10%. So therefore, as you can tell, for the bottom quartile of workers, it is impossible to make minimum wage without enormous physical labor and strain. But it's also important to say that at the time we were writing the report, domestic workers in Tamil Nadu were on strike, saying that the Tamil Nadu domestic work minimum wage was too low. It was only 8,500 rupees. Karnataka is between 12 and 14,000 rupees. So for example, if we took the Karnataka minimum wage, say we took 12,000, then domestic workers in Chennai would have to work, the bottom 10% would have to work in 12 households to make that Karnataka minimum wage. And the bottom 30% would have to work in 3. Delhi has a higher minimum wage for domestic workers than both Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. And for workers in Chennai and Bangalore to make domestic work minimum wage at Delhi rates, the bottom 30% would have to work in 6 households. So effectively what we can see is a deeply bifurcated market where the top 30% of domestic workers are making what we would call living wages, but the majority of domestic workers are not. But the perception of these wages are really split by the nature of part-time domestic work. And the real challenge is the next data point, which is that because domestic work is seen as largely unskilled, and because employers are not certain how much money domestic workers make, 55% of our sample believe they paid generously, and 48% believe they paid adequately. Now, this is a really important finding in an employer survey, because one argument could be, could we expect market-based increments in domestic workers' wages? As employers get richer, as households get better, will they pay domestic workers more? This seems very unlikely, because most employers already believe they are generous employers in terms of monetary payments. And this bodes, therefore, it doesn't bode well for natural wage increases due to market dynamics. So therefore, we go back to the question that if wages for domestic workers are to increase, they're going to have to be pushed. They're not going to rise on their own. And we will come back to the question of collective action and organizing on this very closely. One thing that does seem to be task and rate card kind of training, particularly for part-time urban domestic work. And we'll return to that later as we go on.
We also asked employers about non-wage benefits, what kinds of non-wage benefits were available, and we present 3 here. One is the maternity entitlements. It was quite interesting to note that across the boards, while other report we find that employers seemed empathetic towards their workers, it was something that they were not willing to take on as employers. So about 36% of employers in Bangalore said that they would give some form of support, but 31% also said that it could be in the form of one-time lump sum amount and discontinuation. So 1 in 10 households suggested dismissal of the worker during the maternity break that she would need. Now this has deep implications for the way we imagine social protection, especially in terms of maternity benefits, because the employers seem to believe that they have a replacement cost, and hence are on this particular aspect aren't quite sure how they would support workers if she were to take a maternity break. The trend is very similar for Chennai as well. In terms of illness, and this is an interesting finding, while maternity break didn't seem any takers, in terms of illness, employers seem to be more willing to support their workers. And in the next report, we'll tell you how there was also the language of mutual dependency, right? The employer needed the worker as much as the worker needed the employer. And so they were, in terms of illnesses, they still felt that it would be okay to support. So there was much more wide support in terms of this practice. About 40% in Bangalore and 37% of employers in Chennai said that they would support expenses for treatment directly. This is again a very important finding when one thinks of what kinds of non-wage benefits or support workers should get in this sector. Further, 30% in both cities supported sick leave, but as you will see in the as you'll see in terms of leave, about 70% in Bangalore and 80% in Chennai said that their workers actually had access to leave. And yet the other interesting point that came up was that the workers rarely or almost never took leave. And this is a really important point because it also brings forth, we'll again talk to you about it later, but just a brief snapshot. It also talks about the lack of employment security that workers fear, right? They think there will be a punitive action if they take too many leaves, and hence even if they are sick, even if they are unwell, continue to come to work and rarely or almost never take leave, as the employers have reported in this study. This is not a worker study. In Chennai, the numbers are very similar. It's about 16 to 28%. So for us, these points actually really talk about what kinds of support systems should the workers then, workers' organization should then aim to ask for when we talk about any kinds of negotiations with the employers.
Yeah. And finally, just to conclude the key findings of the second report. So our first finding when we look at the quality of employment is a worrying sense that for many employers, they do not consider domestic work formally as work, the way they compare it to construction, even to other forms of informal work, whether to not formal work. There is a language, you'll see our third report, which is entirely ethnographic, you will see the language of domestic workers being described as people who do some work for extra money for the household. This is deeply rooted in gender and caste notions of work. The work is seen as unskilled, the work is seen as undervalued, the work is seen as an extension of normal gender responsibilities of cooking and cleaning. So there's a lot of language of women's work, whether it's being done out. The part-time nature of the work creates a socialization where basically employers say, she's only here for an hour. Right? So there's a sense also of a disassociation of responsibility that returns. But one of the larger points that we are pointing out in the nature of a labor market, a labor market that is so thickly social, where not only are caste and gender shaping recruitment practices, but they're shaping the valuation of work, which is then translating into inadequate wages, means that no matter how much legislation and policy and mandate we do, employers in private homes do need to be made to rethink the value of domestic work itself. And one has to think about how one does that. Other informal work sectors have measured the contribution of workers to the GDP. Sanitation workers and waste workers have done this. Waste workers have claimed and refashioned themselves as environmental warriors, workers that lead to sustainable development. Values and reshapes work, because we know that given the fact that employers are within private homes, the reach of labor inspectors, the reach of policy implementation has always been very difficult. You will hear in the next report many employers and what they think about the idea of a law for domestic workers, what they think about the idea of social protection, and many of them simply do say that we don't want the state in our house. And so therefore the question of how domestic work is valued is disproportionately important in this sector in which it is not in others. The second finding for us is that therefore if we talk about making domestic work formal, there's a lot of talk in informal work always to say the way to improve it is to formalize it. It is not, we have to be specific about what we mean by formalizing. Do we mean domestic workers should have contracts like formal workers? But what relationship do those contracts have to the very different attitudes you heard about employers vis-a-vis maternity, where they are deeply opposed, versus payment for illness, where they are deeply supportive? So therefore, being specific about which parts of the quality of employment employers are already supportive in. In the third report, we'll introduce this as a very, my colleague Antara used the word in our Bangalore launch, a dark opening. Because the question is that there is one doesn't want to compromise on maternity entitlement, but one also wants to incrementally start taking what we can get in terms of, say, health expenses. But if the language of those protections are not coming from a language of rights and entitlements, but actually a language of empathy or care, then they're also coming with deeply gendered assumptions about domestic workers not really being workers, but being folks that are being extended empathy and solidarity as opposed to rights and entitlements. And we'll discuss this after the break in more detail. It also matters to us in some ways that when we think of some of the evidence of this report, many employers are not supportive of health insurance for domestic workers, but are supportive of directly paying the medical bills of domestic workers when they are ill. They're supportive of paying school fees for their children. So the form of the delivery of social protection seems to change the way employers think about them. We have to ask, why is it that the paying of medical expenses seems to be a widespread norm among employers, but maternity leave seems to be completely something unimaginable? So one of the things is also to say, if we want to think about a new policy for domestic workers, and we want to think about their rights to health coverage as workers, should we be thinking about forms of direct payment or of insurance? One of them may find more traction with employers than others. The third part very much is that the action of implementation of any of these policies or of the collective action of unions will have to be at the neighborhood. Making laws that are at Tamil Nadu state level are not going to implement a domestic worker market if all the hiring is happening with reputation and referral in neighborhoods. So the question is, how do we intervene into a labor market that is disproportionately defined as the neighborhood? Domestic worker unions in Bangalore have started making tripartite arrangements with apartment federations, because it is only with apartment federations they get the maximum impact on both wage cards as well as grievance redressal as well as medical expenses. So do we need to think of new governance mechanisms for policy that are not just the labor department at the state level, but are in fact decentralized neighborhood level associations, RWAs, ward councillors? What does that action look like at the neighborhood scale is a very different imagination of policy than we are used to. Even in construction, the acts apply to construction sites that are public workspaces. And this goes back to the peculiarity of domestic work as the only sector where the workplace is a private home of another person. And therefore the policy mechanisms need to change appropriately. There is a very deep need to keep understanding that this is not just an economic market. Both the personalization of the reputation of the domestic worker, you will hear in the third report about trust and loyalty and obedience and verification by neighbors referring each other, but also the fact that caste and region dynamics remain very strong. One of the strong things that will come up after the break also is the question of age, where domestic workers are being aged out of the market much earlier than in other worker construction sectors. And the final part then is to make and re-emphasize the importance of collective action. What our data is telling us quite clearly is that even with urbanization and changing household income, market dynamics are unlikely to make a change in the quality of employment for domestic workers. Wages are unlikely to rise. You remember that most of our employers think they are generous in their wage payments. And even though the demand for domestic workers will rise with urbanization, the quality of employment will need intervention and regulation of different kinds. And the question for us to think about what that looks like. So we'll pause here. We know it's a lot. This is what happens when you present 3 years of work in an hour. But we'll pause and be here for discussions. We're happy to take some individual questions now, and we have our tea break in about 10 minutes from now, but we can also give you a slightly longer break at this moment. So we'll pause at this point, and if there are any responses or clarifications or questions to the first two reports, we'll take them here, and then we'll present the third report after the break. Thank you so much for your attention. We know it's a lot to take through. Sure. If someone will, I'm sure, translate. Please go ahead.
என்னோட கேள்வி என்னன்னா, ஆக்சுவலி மினிமம் வேஜ் படி 8 ஹவுஸ் ஹோல்டர்ஸ் கொடுக்குறாங்க அப்படின்ற டொமஸ்டிக் ஒர்க்கர்ஸ் அந்த எம்ப்ளாய் சொல்லியிருக்காங்க அப்படின்னு சொல்லிடும்போது எந்த அடிப்படையில் மினிமம் வேஜை கால்குலேஷன் பண்ணி இவங்க கொடுக்குறாங்கன்னு சொல்லிட்டு சொன்னீங்கன்றது எங்களுக்கு ஒரு கிளாரிஃபிகேஷன் வேணும்.
What is the form? Basic calculations is the employer calculating the minimum basic wage?
No, the employers are calculating wage mostly on the basis of tasks. The state minimum wage that we were saying In Karnataka, it is divided by task groupings. In Tamil Nadu, it was not, and that was one of the reasons for protests around the Tamil Nadu domestic wage. In Karnataka, they have identified a mix of cleaning and domestic services, and those 8 are given that same point. So there is a card that in both the states, there is a move to do not hour-based, but task-based minimum wage. I'll translate.
Um,
Per hour, that's right. Yeah. No, that was definitely when we were writing the protest that was happening in Tamil Nadu, precisely because the Tamil Nadu minimum wage was not speaking of tasks and it was not high enough. Both those protests were happening at the same time. So I can check what the new Tamil Nadu regulation has now done. But I think what our data would say is that a time-based calculation of minimum wage would be deeply inadequate. And the idea what to think about.
I also wanted to add, actually it's part of the third report, but since the question has come, a lot of the wages are also being calculated at the neighborhood level. So even if there is a minimum wage at the state level, we find from our study that actually the rates are being calculated at the neighborhood level. So the households are actually using the logic of, it's a calculation between what they can afford, what the going rate is in the neighborhood, and what they think the worker will accept. So it's a, like a 3 things that they put together as a consideration, and that's how wages. So the neighborhood effect is actually very strong in wage rates, and hence the minimum wages does not, in that sense, hold true at the neighborhood level.
In terms of the wage calculation, it's not only to be looked at the task, but also to be looked at in terms of quantum. Like for example, cleaning in a household for 3 family members differs from cleaning vessels in a household which comprises of 7 to 8 one. That's one thing I just probably that we need to look into. Another thing is domestic work is not actually recognized as paid work because probably because of given the cultural norms, deeply it's patriarchal, wherein the women themselves actually they go through this drudgery every day. Like I'm sure, like all those who are sitting in this hall, definitely they have their own thing. So probably this need to be looked at by the state as a kind of public service. Like for example, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, wherein the state has invested more in terms of providing maternity benefits or childcare facilities. There, the percentage of people who are actually engaged in paid work has increased. So like that, we can actually go and give a lot many examples from different countries. So I think for domestic work to get recognized as paid work, I think even bringing in change in the mindset, the attitude towards which the state also has a larger role to play in terms of actually doing tax justice by bringing in making certain things like mandatory.
Absolutely. No, I think so on your first point, one thing that's quite striking about how undervalued the work is, we find that as the household size or even the number of rooms in the household increase, wages don't increase that much, which means that the neighborhood effect and the cap effect is so powerful that a genuine task-based distribution would mean that a 6-person family with a 4-room house would have more money than a 3-person family in a 2-room house. And the differences are almost non-existent when you take the crosstabs. And this is why there's these effects at the neighborhood level. You'll hear in the third report of employers saying, I cannot pay more than this because my neighbor will tell me, why are you paying more than this? Right? So the lock-in cap effect. So in fact, to answer the question earlier, there are many mechanisms where a maximum wage is being enforced. There are far fewer mechanisms where the minimum wage is being ensured. So caps to wages are coming from everywhere. And so the notion of the rate card is by a lot of units is precisely to say it depends on the number of rooms, it depends on the quantum of work, it depends on the size of the family. But this is where the push is trying to go. So but where we are now is far from that. And the question about the state, I think, is absolutely right. For us, one of the main reasons to do this study and to do it with ILO is we've worked with unions for so long, and finally at some point, one of them said to us and said, look, we have studied ourselves for years. Go study employers so we can go to the state. So we can actually talk about this as a market, talk about it as a sector. So really our hope is that a lot of this data will help us push to the state and say you have to professionalize and speak of this work at a city scale, at a labor market scale. And if you do that, these are the ways to do it. So this is precisely the hope, to put that point.
Just an intervention
Yeah.
to make. The notion of professionalization of this particular work has come up very differently, which is with this kind of urban companies where they employ men and where by square feet cleaning is done and other things done. The whole dynamic which has changed with shift of the whole market and where recruitment of men take place, and then conversely this has relationship with wage market. So therefore I think this dynamic is changing. We definitely
Actually, we'll
have
come.
to,
I feel like we're giving the
we
suspense
have
away,
to,
but
because
we'll,
this interface is very important.
Yes.
Interface between this whole metropolitan, of course.
Yeah.
Again, this is something to do with metropolitan.
so we discussed this in the third report as well. where
We looked at both agencies and hiring on both sides. Yeah.
As a union activist, I feel really heartened with your report, because I've been trying to push certain ideas for several years, for maybe decades. Sometimes people don't realize, I've been saying we have to form ward level associations and see to it how the government and councillors will start working at the ward level, because basically our membership is actually very local. Our membership does not actually have the time to look around and see law, you know. This is what we had a discussion yesterday when ILO was visiting us and meeting our domestic workers committee. They were talking of how they were negotiating their leave bonus at that local level, and in certain neighborhood pockets we are getting success where they've made the conscious effort to do it. In other neighborhoods they have not, because of not a failure to on the part of the union or government, but their own failure to take it up. And one interesting thing, how perception of employers is very important. We have a pamphlet which we actually was in English and Tamil. So our union members actually took that pamphlet, and it was a bonus pamphlet which goes directly to the employer. Even households which were not giving bonus in that same community started to give bonus. And yesterday one of the leaders of that area said that not only they gave bonus, but the non-domestic worker employees were also given a sort of a Diwali gift of some kind, a hamper or something. So I'm now it's confirming some of the discussions which domestic workers are bringing to us, that employers respond to certain types of campaigns and direct contacts and building awareness among them. I think that's it's really very good. I'm going to actually see that we should translate the report and make union leaders also read this. Yeah, I think it'll make a big difference. Thank you. I mean, it really, I've been I was just telling our members that we spent 1 year to prepare a wage card, similar to the one you're saying, that task but people don't get convinced. The leadership doesn't get convinced to even reach out to the membership. So somewhere union leaders are failing and they're not really listening to members. So you have been listening to employers, whereas we have to learn to listen to our members.
Because when we come back, we literally hear from the employers in their own words, and we'll have a lot to say about agencies and urban plans. So that
solution yet. Working on it.
What science says about procrastination. Creating to-do list is not going to help you. Installing Pomodoro app is not going to help you. Watching more productivity videos and going online doing courses is not going to help you. Unless you do this one thing, that is to rewire your brain. Hi, my name is Dr. Meghna Dixit. I'm the author of the book You Matter and Brain and Performance Expert. If you're suffering from procrastination for a long time, you always worry about the results, you fear taking actions, then I want to tell you that procrastination has become a habit for you now. But thankfully, you can get rid of this unwanted habit by rewiring your brain, and neuroscientists call it neuroplasticity. With neuroplasticity, you can actually rewire your old patterns and perceptions in your brain and get rid of unwanted habits like procrastination. If you want to learn how to do it in a simple and easy way, then click on the link below and register now for my 4-hour live masterclass, Ultimate Success Builder. Along with this masterclass, you will also get my 3 exclusive solution courses worth rupees 6,400 for free. Thousands of people have gone through this experience and they are buzzing about the workshop everywhere. So quickly click on the link below and register. I will see you inside the workshop.
Analysis of what you heard, bits and pieces of what you heard in the second report. So in the third report, we look at employers' perceptions and practices with reference to domestic work. This is a qualitative archive. We really wanted to understand what is the language and what is the articulation of the employer, and what are their perceptions and rationale as well as motivations when they think about domestic work. How do they engage, what is the value they place, and how do they perceive both domestic work and the workers. In this report, we focus on three aspects. So there are three broad sections to this report. The first one looks at recruitment. Where are workers hired? How are they hired? Why do employers prefer these recruitment channels? And also looking at what we call as a recruitment preferences. What do they look for in a worker when they employ or when they look for when they go to find a worker in the labor market? The second question was on employment relationship. So looking at wages, how are wages determined? We've already had some of that conversation before the break, but we'll give you a more in-depth analysis here. Also looking at non-wage support and talking about employers' responsibilities. What do employers think is their responsibility towards their worker? That's a really interesting insight of this report. And then the third section, we look at employers' outlooks towards legal coverage and social protection for domestic workers. So what do employers think is their role? Do they think there should be social protection, and so on? Just a quick note on the sample. We in total looked at 403 households across Chennai and Bangalore. This is across various neighborhoods of the of the two cities, and the income distribution of the employers is similar to the first and the second report. Also a quick reflection on doing field work where you have to do qualitative data collection in employer homes. We had lots of challenges because we found that the employers would not even open the doors. If they did, it would be shut on our face. In one case, one of our interviewers faced 68% rejection. That is the kind of field work, in gaps in between COVID, that is the kind of field work we had to do to get to this report. I'll start with recruitment channels. One of the key findings of our report, and here we pick up on what we presented in report 2, is that the labor market here is very thickly and socially, thickly social and spatial as well. So for workers, while it makes sense to work with employers that are close to their homes, we find that employers also look for workers that live in the neighborhood. So there's a huge neighborhood effect in recruitment as well. The few key words that came up through our interviews were words like safety, trust, quality, and verification of the worker, right? So employers wanted to pick up on these neighborhood channels because they could then employ workers that were already working in the neighborhood. So there was an implicit assumption that some form of verification had already occurred. And the other factor that we thought workers were really, that employers really looked for was aspects such as trust, loyalty, and dependability. And this was particularly valued in long-term relationships, which we found in several neighborhoods in old parts of Bangalore and Chennai, where perhaps families have been living for several generations. So either they had the same worker with the family for a couple of generations, or the same family had different workers from the worker's family over multiple generations. So there was a long-term relationship between the worker and the employer. And here, because this is a qualitative interview, we thought we will just quickly quote from a few employers so you hear the language and the words from the employer's mouth. And I quote here, "There is risk in hiring unfamiliar people. It is better to hire workers who are familiar and well known to us and the neighborhood." So the idea is not just to hire a worker that you know as a family, but even if you depend on WhatsApp groups in the neighborhood, you're looking for workers that are known to the neighborhood. So implicit is that there would be some kind of verification, but also some kind of way to sort of know where the worker lives, which neighborhood the worker comes from, and so on. Her house is nearby, and I quote again, "Important to know such things, but she's a good person, would never touch jewelry or valuables at home." So the idea of trust and loyalty being really important. We also found that employers did hire from new forms of hiring services. For example, as it was mentioned before, for example, for specific cleaning tasks, right? For like the Urban Company or one of these apps, but those were mostly for specific tasks and were not for daily household work. In some cases where the employer hired from hiring agencies, it was mostly for full-time work. So part-time workers were mostly hired from the neighborhood channels. In terms of recruitment preferences, and that was an important question, what did they look for when they set out to hire a worker? As we mentioned before, skills was not so surprisingly perhaps, was not talked about at all. Nobody told us they were looking for a skilled worker. In fact, domestic work seemed to be completely unskilled to the employers. But what they really looked for was, one, the identity-based parameters. So thinking about the age of the worker, the religion, caste, language, or the region of origin. And in case of caste and religion, though the direct response of the employer often was that they did not care about these identities, it came out in the name of cultural preferences or social preferences, right? So somebody said, we would want our workers to belong to our religion so that they know how to put the rangoli, for example. So these kind of quotes that the employers gave us. But more importantly, what the employers looked for were a composite set of traits and attributes within the worker. For example, trust and loyalty, as already mentioned, but hygiene, cleanliness, punctuality, flexibility, and most importantly, a non-argumentative worker. And that sort of really stood out for us, and I'll quote here again. Someone who is a bit submissive and takes on work efficiently. We don't want anyone who is argumentative and takes too many leaves. So the idea of a submissive worker, a quiet worker, a non-argumentative worker was something that was important to the employers, because that would also mean the worker would listen to what the employer had to say and would not argue for higher wages and so on. And in terms of age, it was really it was a curious case, because we realized that the labor market for the domestic worker is then really short. Nobody wants an old worker, because then that would mean having to negotiate with an older person in the household. So for example, I prefer someone who is young, because you take an elderly person, she's not going to give you such good quality of work. And in the same vein, some other employers telling us, for example, if she has a small baby, that is a no-no for me. When the baby is not well, you cannot be a tyrant and ask her to come to work. So in that sense, the age group seems to be somewhere from a married woman who is about 25 to 30 to all the way about 40, but that's pretty much. Then even 45 seem too old for an employer when hiring a worker. And finally, I'd like to also add that the concept of trust, though we got it in skills and attributes, it was something that ran throughout the interviews. The idea that you needed a trustworthy worker, which was sort of an attribution that was made to the entire class or caste of workers that do domestic work, right? So assumption that you had to be more conscious about this worker being within your household, and this is the final quote, they must be trustworthy and they should not steal any items or money. Whatever we keep, it will be there only, and that's why we don't let her go at all. So employers were also willing to pay a premium for a trustworthy worker or for somebody who was loyal and committed to the family.
Despite being informal in nature, domestic work is regular salaried work. It implies that wages are being paid almost monthly by the employer. Wages are also a core element of social dialogue between the employers, workers, and the state. We found that employers calibrated running rates in the neighborhood for tasks or units of work, workers' wage expectations, and their own affordability. We've selected some quotes here from the study for you to see how employers were articulating this. I generally ask others how much they are paying for similar kind of tasks in the building, and then I ask the domestic worker, how much are you expecting? They also said, we can only pay what I can afford. So these were the three sort of critical factors going into determining wages. We also found that even if the employer could afford higher wages, they were hesitant to pay more because they didn't want to sort of get backlash from the neighborhood that they were living in. And I quote, the moment you pay more, the word spreads. The neighbors will say, why are you spoiling the market? We know from previous studies that domestic worker unions have wage rates, but our study finds that neighborhood wage rate cards also exist, locking both the worker and the employer in sort of like a wage ceiling. Employment security. So employers across the sample said that they believe that domestic work is much better than other forms of informal work, such as street vending or construction work. There is the idea that the willingness to keep a worker is there as long as, you know, the worker follows instructions. And one of the quotes to highlight this kind of sentiment from the study is, as long as you work the way I want, there's nothing to worry about job security. We also found that employment security for the worker was not considered the responsibility of the employer, and it was deeply subjective to each employer. So it's very important to highlight that this is a very heterogeneous group of replies that have come within our study, and within the 400 interviews that we did. We do see patterns, but it's deeply individual. Workplace facilities was something else that we asked, and through the study we found that giving workplace facilities to workers such as drinking water and utensils and access to toilets and food varied among employers again. We found that many employers were open to giving facilities such as drinking water, you know, because they said that they could segregate the plate and the glass of the worker, and therefore, of course, that such facilities should also be made available. We found that many employers, also provided food, and it was considered as part of the wages many times. So, but again, it was a deeply individualized decision. So where some employers insisted that, at least one time food is had by the worker at their homes, the others were shared experiences, shared practices such as giving leftover food to the workers, so that they can take it away. And there were some who also said that if the worker was refusing to take, in one instance only, one of the workers, domestic workers, was refusing to take the food that was left over, and the employer was very sort of surprised by that and said, she's just throwing it in the bin, she should take it away. And so, these kind of sort of articulations we also found in our study. We found that unlike food and water, where many employers were sort of open to kind of providing food and water, giving access to toilet to workers was much less. So the few employers who did give access to toilets usually either had a segregated toilet within the household, and that, you know, sort of like an outside toilet that the worker could use. And this was, it's important to note that then they said this is not just for the domestic worker, but myriad of workers, you know, all sorts of workers that come in to their households. Also, because of the new building typologies that are coming up in our cities, many said that there are common toilets that are there for the whole building for all the workers to access. Where they could not or were not able to give, you know, were refusing to give access to toilets, employers sort of articulated that in many different ways. Some said that we all have a very small house ourselves, so it's very difficult for us to segregate, so therefore we are, we are unable to offer. We would like to offer it, but we are unable to offer it at this moment. Others said that there were public toilets that workers to kind of access, and some others also said that when it came to toilets, that their worker is only coming to their house for like 45 minutes to 1 hour. So they kind of feel that within that 1 hour they don't need access to the toilet. So in some ways employers not taking into cognizance the fact that the worker is going to multiple houses for an hour and a half. So this goes into paid and unpaid leaves, so many employers reported that if it was a medical emergency, they were open to sort of giving leaves to their workers, because it's sort of also a quid pro quo situation. If she's unwell, then the work won't get done, etc. And but many employers, and this is also a thing with COVID now, because there were many people who were working from home, said that they would be open to giving leaves, but the worker must inform them beforehand, because if there's a sudden leave, then their work will go all over the place. And I quote, this was somebody that we'd interviewed that said, sometimes they take leave suddenly and then my work gets affected. I just can't get out of my desk and start doing housework. So you have to inform me. So I'm open to you taking leaves, but inform me first. And the others said that if there was any kind of long leaves, so if somebody said they need leave for a month, then they said that was just non-negotiable and that they would replace the worker. The other was medical support. Medical support for workers was remarkably high. Some employers said that it was their duty to support workers during their time of illness. Some said that they paid for the medical bills. Others said they helped them in going to proper hospitals or understanding their medical reports. Some said that every time the workers asked for financial support, they reported it as a medical emergency or a death in the family. So an employer said that the worker feels, one of the employees said that she feels that the worker now feels obligated to come and work for her because she's paid off her medical bills. So employers also recognizing that kind of vulnerability that exists in the lives of workers. So if you do something, then there is an obligation, and therefore, other negotiations get stalled. Maternity leave is something that we asked employers about, and where they acknowledged the need for leaves during childbirth, but they thought that it was a very complex sort of an arrangement, and there were concerns about how to replace the worker, or how to do things when the worker is not there, or sort of affordability. So saying that if I'm going to have another worker for the time period that my current worker is on maternity leave, how do I sort of afford to salaries, etc. And also the idea of returning to work was, for the worker, was deeply sort of, it again was very subjective. So somebody said that if I really like the worker, then yes, even after a maternity break, I'd like to have her back. If not, then I think that relationship is over and I'll go and get a new worker instead. So other employers sort of said that, maternity leaves are in the ambit of the government. We can only do so much. It's the responsibility of the government to provide these things, and it's not an employer responsibility. The other thing that we asked was about childcare. and many employers emphasize the need for childcare facilities and that there is a lack of social infrastructure in our cities where, children, where mothers can drop the children and come, etc. But similarly, to kind of ask them if the worker could bring the child to the place of work, they were sort of a regular arrangement on that was not something that the employers were keen on. And one of the reasons was that the employers gave, some of the reasons was that the worker would not have time to then do her work, and would also be then looking after her child at the same time. Or if the worker is working, then the care responsibility of the child would come on the employer. So, that was not something that they were very keen on. And occasionally, if the children were to come, that's all right. But there were, again, really subjective sort of articulations of how the children themselves should be. So they must be neat, they must be quiet, they mustn't touch things, they mustn't go all over the house, or that they must not be very, very young. And then the worker could sort of bring their children. And in Bangalore, when we were presenting this, my colleague Anta also said that many times the workers themselves have said that it's a challenge to sort of bring a child to a place of work because you're also then going to multiple homes. And that is also sort of, something that is to think about when we think of childcare for domestic workers. But the other surprising space where there was a remarkably positive sort of outlook of the employers was supporting the education of children. This was done through, interest-free loans, buying school items, supplies and paying school fees, paying advance payments on salaries so that, they could pay the school fees of their children, even lump sum sort of, advance payments were given, etc. And they kind of, many employers said that they looked at it as either an interest-free loan that the worker could slowly then pay off with her salary at whatever she felt was, she was sort of able to take some cuts monthly. Some said we took half back, but the others we didn't take at all. So, children's education was something that was felt that it was an employer responsibility, it was a form of non-wage support where many, many employers were sort of interested in supporting the worker and her children. So, again, the notion of employer responsibility was found to be deeply subjective. Like I said, it's not we did not find one homogeneous answer. We find patterns, repeat patterns over our, over the 400 interviews. But, the employers are articulating, sort of things like honoring the verbal contracts, because we know that there are no formal contracts. So honoring verbal contracts, being fair, counseling and listening to the workers and ensuring safety were considered the responsibilities of employers. It is important to note that these articulations are not coming from a place of rights of the workers. It's coming more from an empathetic point of view. And having said that, there are still sort of possibilities, like we are saying. I mean, whether these possibilities are, it's just building it slowly, like, it's already been said, these are maybe not even proper sort of avenues to get in, but they do exist in employer responsibility, and it would be up to unions and, the workers to kind of go through and decide which ones they would want to take up with their employers. So, yeah.
Moving on, so the Decent Work for Domestic Work framework says legal coverage of domestic workers for social protection and for labor rights is one of the first key milestone that you have to achieve to move towards decent work. So in our study, one of our inquiries was to understand employer outlook on having such a legal coverage, and we asked 3 questions. What do you think of having a law or policy for domestic workers? What do you think of having social protection for domestic workers? And if there was any way to provide social security to domestic workers, would you be willing to contribute, and how? I should mark that while a lot of questions in our interview schedule did not elicit long responses, but this set of questions elicited a lot of responses, and some transcriptions even went on to run for multiple pages. Now, so why did we do this? We feel narratives like this make 2 key contributions. One, it creates an archive of employer outlook and the language that they use on the question of regulating this sector. It is a perspective that is understudied and it is underreported, since employer studies are hard to do. 2, it offers the possibility of categorizing some of these various kinds of responses that we are getting, so it can guide communication plans for opening up possibilities of longer conversations and negotiating with at least the willing and the more ambivalent employers. Now for the first question about what do they think about having a legal coverage of social protection for domestic workers. As is expected, employers' orientation towards this was to avoid it and discourage it. In other words, employers are not keen for having any legal intervention in the sector. However, on closer reading of the narratives, we have reason to believe that all the willingness is not the same. We see three set of responses based on their inclination for any kind of legal intervention in the relationship. And we try to group these responses at this stage because we don't want to get paralyzed by the kind of heterogeneity and just the variety that we see, because we need to move towards practice and actions. So the first set of responses simply deny the need for any kind of regulation in the sector. An employer did not recognize, as Gautam also earlier said, did not recognize domestic work as work, but something that the worker did only to earn a little more money for their families to survive. Or another employer who did not see domestic work as work proper like other sectors because it only involved 10 to 15 minutes of work. And we know from several studies on domestic workers that it is not true. Some of these domestic workers work from 6 to 8 hours, some even going up to 10 hours a day. There were also narratives about there being no need for regulation because the domestic workers already had good earnings and good working condition. As one employer marks, everybody is giving a reasonable wage and the domestic workers will surely ask for it. They work in 3 to 5 houses and they receive more than 10,000 a month as salary. We are giving wages based on their demand. And such responses were not exceptional. Many other employers had similar notions that domestic workers were earning a decent wage and it was in a range that exceeded 10,000 rupees a month at least. However, from other studies, we know that this is not true again. A second set of responses are also not keen for regulation, but they do speak about what in particular do they wish to avoid. There were several separate kinds of articulations, but to express that they worry that any regulation will increase the wages and try to regulate it, and they do not want it. The wage question is certainly a key issue of conflict of interest here. Some even flip it to say that a revision of wages can hurt the workers. To quote, if the rates go up because it is now organized, there will be many people who may not be able to afford the services, and then it is the domestic workers who will lose out. There are many people who may not be earning well, but they need a domestic worker. They may have to discontinue. To quote another employer here, if you are going to hold me accountable for these people, then I would think twice before hiring them. But when we read these along with the findings from report 1, where a large portion of housework was being given out to a domestic worker, it is something that should not be simply read as it is. Letting go of domestic workers for these households may not be as simple as they appear in these narratives. Others held the opinion that state should be responsible for the domestic worker and the regulation should be about what the state must do and not the employers. Now, a lot of workers also have come to this point, but we should remember that it comes from a place of being unable to imagine how can such a large number of employers, and especially these households which are actually private places and not companies or factories, can be monitored. Now there were also employers who were apprehensive that such intervention may ignore employers' interest and tilt the existing power balance towards the worker. To quote, if we have a separate law, they will speak a lot, they will come for work, they will order us. Even though we are doing a lot of things, they will talk to us like, I won't do this, I won't do that. Another employer speaks of having a benchmark for the workers also in such a law. If we have such a law, it will be very good if the workers stick to it. They should meet standard of work, they should come regularly as one is expected to in an organization. We need to find a balance in policy that sees that both the parties are not affected badly. Domestic workers can be very demanding. So there is this worry that any such legal intervention that comes will prioritize the workers' interest, employers' interest. Now a third set of responses signal about a group of employers who may be more open to some form of policy intervention in this sector. However, there is a hesitation, and it stems from this distrust in states' ability to implement something that is meaningful. To share an example here, it is a welcome gesture, but having a law is not a big deal, but how these laws are implemented. If it is successful. In this case, if somebody does not follow the rules, if someone does not take a responsibility, who will penalize them is a big question. Another employer marks, there are so many policies for workers today, but workers are still in the same condition. I do not know if these policies do really work. I would prefer to help her directly if I have to. The employees themselves worry that the state in India will not be able to create a system that can monitor so many employers, and thus employers will find a way to avoid it or circumvent around it. However, there were also employers who, despite the hesitancy, thought it would still be good to have legal intervention to set new benchmark for employer attitudes. Or as one employer shares, lots of households treat these people without compassion. These people work hard for a living, and thus they should get the protection and the benefits that they deserve. Next. So now moving on to the second question that we ask about what is the employer's outlook on social protection itself. While there is a lack of openness to the idea of having a formal work contract or a law or having the employment relationship overall under scrutiny, on the question of whether domestic workers should have social protection, there is no consensus and a positive outlook. We sense this opening for two reasons. One, several employers recognize the need for social protection of domestic workers. They get less salary, they cannot afford if they get a big illness. And this kind of awareness comes because the domestic workers also, every time their need for an urgent loan or an urgent advance, it is the employers that they come back to, right? Another employers reflected on the entire period of COVID, and they said, see, social security is important for all. Suppose COVID came again, which is an emergency. People who have insurances and power and money survived. Others who had nothing suffered a lot. So in terms of medical health, so if there is a medical or health emergency or inflation, they will always find it difficult. Everything will be increasing in the coming time, and even if the employer increases their salary by say 200 rupees a year, it will not improve their overall standard of life. So if there is a medical or health emergency, because many other studies in this report, many studies and also the previous report that my colleague just presented, we see that several employers already do give things that are equivalent of language benefits. Whereas many other studies in this report many studies and also the previous report that my colleague just presented, we see that several employers already do give things that are equivalent of language benefits. But still the problem is well as discussion and variation. That is, who pays, who does not, and those who pay, what do they pay for? Now, when we look at the language of recognizing this need, of providing a non-wage support, we see that this openness to social protection, as Gautam said, is largely in the language of care, help, and empathy. Very few use the language of rights and entitlements for workers. Then while there is certainly an opening for social protection policy, we need to think that if such an opening is a dangerous opening, or should we go ahead with it? We think one must be careful to counter and balance it with a language of rights eventually, to identify the entitlements as rights of domestic workers. Next. Yeah. Lastly, when we come to the question of whether employers would be willing to actually contribute financially to a social protection for domestic workers, we again see that there is a tension and no clear consensus. I'll go through this briefly, and we can pick it up in the summary or the question and answer later. So affordability comes up several times, and it includes many reasons. So sometimes the employers are actually struggling to have the means to contribute, and at other times employers seem to have conflicting economic and financial needs. Secondly, sometimes employers are willing to contribute, but it is conditional. They would say that if the state contributes, then I would contribute a similar amount, or I would be willing to contribute if it is for my long-term domestic worker, not for a short-term domestic worker. Some even went on to say that the workers themselves might not be interested in some of these popular forms of social protection, such as medical insurance or pension, as they seek immediate and in-cash benefits and not some benefits that will accrue to them many years later. Now, another big pattern that kept coming back is that the question of whether it can be delivered successfully, whether it can actually be operationalized, was a huge part of employers deciding whether they want to contribute or not. And lastly, some of them were willing to contribute, and they quoted an amount of 5 to 20%, the imagination being it's 1 to 20% of the salary that they are giving right now. And some also gave a more absolute figure, saying that we'll be willing to give something between 200 to 2,000 rupees. Now, we need to think whether this kind of, when it comes to 1 to 20%, will it end up reducing the actual wages that are being paid, and people start counting the additional contribution as part of the wages, or it's actually additional payments over and above the wages? I'll hand over to Dee for summarizing.
So, just before we get into the summary of the reports, a quick point I wanted to make is that while in the first two reports we presented the broad trends and patterns, in the third report what we really present is an archive of the articulation of the employers themselves. And one of the important things for us through this report was to talk about the heterogeneity in employers, to say that across the city there are various pockets where domestic workers are being employed, but also there are various ways in which employers think about domestic work and domestic workers, which means that for any social protection or any kind of practice or regulation, we need to take into account all the different ways in which employers are negotiating with their workers. One of the first challenges that we sort of saw in the report was that of valuation of work. Because the wage card is so controlled at the neighborhood level, it sort of has a wage ceiling which undervalues the work of the domestic worker. But it also led to what we think of as a segmented labor market. This means that the neighborhood has a strong control on who gets to work in the neighborhood, but also what kind of work is done by certain workers within the neighborhood. And the third point was that around gendered nature of work. The fact that because domestic work is considered to be work that is natural to women, that is an extension of their own household, it was often undervalued. And when this intersects with caste, where a disproportionately large number of workers come from marginalized communities, we find that domestic work remains not only undervalued but also invisible and unrecognized. The second point that we want to sort of present to you is that of the barriers to dignity of work. The subjective judgment of various employers builds the reputation of the worker in some sense, right? So you need to be flexible, but you also need to be punctual, you also need to be trustworthy and loyalty, and these are all ascriptions that the employer is sort of fitting to various workers. And in some sense, the labor market had the idea of what is a good worker. While employers also try to be good employers, there is definitely a notion of a good worker. And this reputation is something that the workers have to constantly sort of uphold in order to be able to operate within that neighborhood, which puts a immense stress on the way workers have to negotiate with individual households, where this is a composite set of skills, composite set of attributes and traits that seem to be differing across households, right? So how do you know which house requires what kind of attributes from you? At the same time, we also found that the alternative to dominance of employer, the dominance of employers in the neighborhood channels came through verification in this recruitment channel. So if unions or workers organizations were to challenge this, it is an important consideration. Where is it that we would sort of campaign and negotiate with the employers? Similarly, and I'd like to use the idea of messy intimacy that the scholar Naila Kabir uses, where she says that for the employer it is their home, but for the worker it is their workplace. And hence it becomes really a very challenging place to negotiate. How do you think about wage rates, wage payments, harassment when there is no redressal mechanism at the workplace of the worker, which in this case is the home of the employer? And hence one of our main suggestions is that we need to think about formulating redressal mechanisms, and what that entry point is that something that we need to really think about carefully, whether it's a tripartite organization or whether it's through workers' organizations. We know that RWAs have their own redressal mechanisms, but it's often from the point of view of the employer. What then is the equivalent for the worker in this case? We also know that it is absolutely critical to have social protection for workers, because that is one way in which the power balance can be tilted towards the workers. As Antara has pointed out, a lot of support that the families today give, whether it's in the form of credit or medical support, is all given through altruism or the idea of a benevolent, good employer, but none of them are translating into rights and entitlements. And because it is so varied across households, it's impossible to hold accountable employers who do not necessarily support their workers. But we also find that in many cases the employers are only hesitant but do not say a no. So there is a window of opportunity there. How do you then push that across the fence and encourage the employers to think about it a little more carefully? What is the way ahead? And perhaps that hesitancy is actually a good window for us to push for greater social protection. But finally, we'd like to conclude that while practice and policy is something that we are really thinking about, we also find that socio-cultural discriminatory practices do exist in this employment relationship, and it comes through quite clearly in our report. And perhaps to address that, we cannot rely on policy and regulation alone. And for that to happen, we need to scrutinize the employment conditions and the employment relation outside of just policy and regulation. And that's also one of our conversation points with unions and workers' organizations, that what is this, what is the avenue to have this kind of conversations with employers, whether it's their network or the RWAs or the neighborhood channels through which workers are being employed. Thank you.
Close by just acknowledging the team that managed to somehow do a 10,000 household survey in a pandemic by managing to do interviews within lockdowns and between, and just to thank our research partners were the Center for Study for Developing Society, CSDS Lokniti, based out of Delhi. You may have seen CSDS Lokniti anytime there is an election, because they do all the pre-election surveys on all the news channels. They're one of those surveys that come. In fact, all the researchers that were involved in the Chennai surveys for CSDS's local team then went on to do pre-election surveys in the last Tamil Nadu election. So they continue to work on that data, and just to also put together. And to thank you all for your time in listening and your patience for the report. To once again thank Neha and Igor for this opportunity. And just to say, we have to study employers has been a strange move for us. We have been researchers within worker organizations and movements for so long that it was only our own union comrades who finally threw us out the door and said, enough, go do things that we need in order to talk to the state. And so just to say, our real intention for this report, for all of these, is to find an archive that all of us in different positions can use to negotiate with the state. What we know is that many forms of data have many forms of audiences, and every time we have talked at the state level, we have been told that our research is anecdotal, that it is full of case studies, that we are telling stories from the field, but we have not been able to make large-scale claims on economic resources and policy. And one of our hopes with work of this scale is to be able to get the conversation going to take domestic work seriously as a form of regulation, and also be able to actually hopefully be able to present to people like the Bangalore Apartment Federation and the Federation of RWAs in the city, and we hope in Chennai again a lot of the audience for this report should be the elite households that are hiring domestic workers, to think about their data and practices as well. So we hope that new conversations around domestic work can start, so that questions around inequality and rights don't only happen with workers, but also happen with employers like they have happened in other sectors. So thank you all very much for your time, and we'll open it up for any comments or suggestions, and particularly reflections. We're very happy that work organizations are also here. We do intend to take the executive summaries of the report and translate them and circulate them. We have to go back to our own union partners who are waiting for the data and have given us notice, so we will start there. And we welcome all partnerships we can do that with that work. And thank you for hosting us at MIDS. It's a pleasure to be here also in the city itself. Thank you very much.
So here's just a thought that I'm putting out, and very knee-jerk thought maybe, but you know, it's something that I think all of you sort of kept going back to at some time or the other when you said the language of the employers is not really one of rights or entitlements, but rather that of compassion and care. But I'm also wondering whether that is necessarily such a bad thing, given that our very political cultures are saturated with the ideas of benevolence, and you know, I mean, think of all the Amma canteens and all our you know, where everything, even the entire business of the contract between the state and citizen is hinges so much on the notions of benevolence and kindness and care and compassion. So I'm wondering whether we are being knee-jerk in our expectation that this language is necessarily a bad one and must be jettisoned, and the more politically correct language of rights and entitlements must take over. Do we necessarily have to see that as a good in and of itself is a question that just occurs to me, because it seems to me that there are many dimensions of this relationship between employers and workers where compassion and care could work just as well, and could meet the need of the worker, besides also humanizing the employer. You know, so these are, I mean, this messy intimacy can also be avenues where deeply human relationships of mutual dependency and unequal but mutual also, so inequality but also mutuality can play out, and whether we should necessarily have that value loaded way of looking at it. I'm not sure it's going to be helpful, so I just wanted to put that out there. Especially on things like, for instance, loans and financial assistance, no, which it might be very difficult to sort of bring within a package of rights and entitlements. No, lots and lots of households in Chennai, I'm sure, have this, not just loans linked to education as you found, but just loans. When the you know, the worker is unable to tide over her own expenses, and that's also because of her conditions or the precarity of her life. So I'm thinking that that's one thing that we could sort of bracket and think about a little more. And the other dimension that was interesting, many dimensions that were interesting, but another thought that I had was about also that women are not necessarily, from the elite households or even the middle to upper income households, are not necessarily getting freed up for paid work because they're employing workers. No? Because that is speaking to this larger concern around where are women today, why are they not in the job markets, right? That's something that we all keep attacking from different angles. And the fact that even if she's able to afford a paid worker and has a domestic worker at home, that she's then, what is happening there? Is it also a sense of letting go of control? Is it supervision? Is it lack of trust? Is it you know, there's something here. No, is it also deeply gendered expectations that at the end of the day, this is my household and I'm responsible here. So while the drudgery of it may have lessened, it may not have freed me up in other ways. So I think that's something that you can also emphasize and talk about a little more. Think about what your data is also telling you on that. If you have more interesting voices from your data on that, I'm sure many audiences would like to hear more about that as well. So that's just a thought I have.
I can respond to one part of that question on you know,
benevolence versus rights and entitlement, we actually thought about it quite a bit while writing the report. And we went back to our data, rewrote sections, because this was constantly a question that we had in mind. But the reason that we sort of framed it this way was because we realized that there was the variation in what the employers articulated as their own affordability was so high that we found that the accountability did not, like, who do you hold accountable when a worker needs help, right? And often the employer kept saying that I will help as long as I can afford it, and you can see across households the idea of affordability changes. Very often the household cannot afford it, but the woman steps in to support. So there is a sense of female solidarity between the worker and the employer, who's the woman, who's supervising, who's looking after the worker, and so on. And so we found what we use the term, the language of control and care constantly. On one hand, the employer is trying very hard to control the worker, making sure work is done appropriately. So on one hand, saying that domestic work is not skilled, and yet saying I have to instruct the worker, there are certain ways in which the work has to be done. So expecting certain outcomes even though the work is not skilled. So this language of, on one hand, I need to control the worker constantly because the household expects it. And if the worker doesn't come, I have to do that work. The woman, feeling responsible for it, but also at the same time using the language of care and support. But then the problem for us while analyzing the data was, who do you then hold accountable if this is the language of care? Because the idea of care is so subjective across households and so varied across households, and there might be just a percentage of workers who are getting this form of care. So then what is then, how do we push the boundaries and think of any kind of universal, not in the sense of the universal rights, but universal rights of the workers? How do we make sure that some of these immediate needs are met? And the quick point is, it often was seen as a way to negotiate for lower wages, that because I provide food to you, I will not give you higher wages because I am doing this extra thing for you. Instead of ever thinking that perhaps if you increased wages, they wouldn't need these additional smaller forms of help. So that was also a big debate within the team. Do we think of these non-wage benefits as a form of support? Do we think of it as part of wage? So in fact, a whole chunk of it we included in wages and then moved it to another section, because the employers, if you read our transcripts, in so many transcripts, the employers tell us, of course, the food is part of the wage, but how does food here become a part of wage, right? Yeah. And in the same breath also telling us, but we don't want the food to get wasted, so we want to make sure the worker takes it. So there is a lot of conflict in this articulation, and hence which is why we stuck to this framework of rights and entitlements over benevolence, because then there is no boundary. I mean, it just becomes so individualized, and it's impossible to hold any employer accountable for that.
I'll add only that, but you can hear us struggle with the tension, because if the motivation is coming from care, I mean, for a lot of, one of the discussions we were in during the transcripts, we were talking to many comrades of ours who are in unions, and some of them were also saying, wherever it comes from, we take it. We'll turn it into rights later. And maybe there is a chronology here of mobilizing around some material security for workers that then over time turns into a more regulated demand. It may move that way. But the question, I think, of in domestic work particularly, because this earlier notion, which has changed very deeply, of this worker is like my family member. This speaking of this almost sort of infantilization, particularly of women workers as people who need care. We've seen this change so much in the last 20 years. Domestic work research, when it was mostly live-in workers, was all about this, she's like my family. Part-time urban professional work has actually professionalized the sector to a great deal. We didn't hear nearly as much of the family language as we used to 10 years ago. It's still there. But now this notion, I think, for us was really then about saying that if we begin from here, we have to be careful not to remain here. I think that's our concern. If it's an opening move, that's strategic, but it could very easily become a final move. Now we have cared, so if you're caring, don't bring rights into this. So much of patriarchy works like this. I care for you, therefore your freedom is not, the price you pay, the price that women pay for reduced mobility is you give up freedom for security. That's always been the debate, right, that young women have to face. So So that's partly the kind of tension that we're navigating. But we are very clear that the existing practices, for example, of supporting medical bills, such a large set of employers paying bills, this is not something we can look away from. It's very important for workers, especially given how bad out-of-pocket health expenses are. So how do we reduce the discretion? How do we reduce the subjectivity? How do we make it something that some employers do because they want to be good employers, and some employers do because it's mandated and that's what professional is? So just to reduce the discretionary element of it, I think, is the key. But certainly the first moves in Social Security will have to use and take advantage of this feeling. So it's a tricky trap, it really is. The labor force participation story, I think we are much clearer about. I think this is what we want to say is that the structural conditions that are preventing educated urban Indian women from working cannot be reduced to only the housework and unpaid work question. There is a lot else structural going on, so it's time to look back again at our public transport systems. It's time to look back again at our norms, our patriarchal norms, why women with domestic workers are still held disproportionately responsible for the status of their house. We have to think a little bit also about whether or not the opportunities that our labor markets are giving are open to these women. Where are university educated women meant to be working if the sectors of employment are not there? So this for us is sort of entering into that conversation very strongly. But I teach at the IIHS Academy in Mussoorie a lot. And every single time I ask senior IIHS officers, why is our women's labor force participation so low? They say housework. It's become their one go-to answer that women are not willing. It's the housework. And what we're trying to say to them is it's not just the housework. Everything else is still constraining this. So it is one of the really findings that we agree we have to make a lot more of. We have less answers on this front, I have to say. But at least we can take one easy getaway, one-size-fits-all explanation off the table.
I also wanted to add to the previous question on, the idea of benevolence is also as long as the worker behaves the way the employer wants them to behave. And this is the strong resistance that you were asking previously about apps and, hiring agencies. This is the reason they strongly resist hiring agencies, because there are rate cards per task, and in many households that had hiring agencies said we don't like them because then the worker does not do any additional task. They will only do as much as they have been told to do as per the rate card. So if I want them to make tea when there is a visitor, or if I ask them to wash a few extra utensils, they won't do it because it's not on their to-do list, right? And so this expectation that the domestic worker is flexible, will do things that are beyond her scope of work, is constantly something that we saw through the transcripts. And so that's why I said the heterogeneity is something that we want to strongly recognize, because for any implementation, intervention, practice, policy, we have to then deal with all this wide spectrum of employer needs, responses, sense of responsibility, and that's something that we've really struggled to articulate in this report. So if you look at the third report, it really in some sense is an archive of the range. We aren't giving you very clear stands, but really telling you these are the various ways in which employers are responding. So anywhere we want to intervene, we have to then think of strategies that will work for all of these different sets of employers.
Chennai, for instance, I don't remember the Bangalore context, that there is this increasing low-income families taking to domestic workers. So in that case, the variation among the employers which has come up is significant in the metropolitan city like Chennai, where you again find the kind of a cost loyalty, what she's talking about as benevolency, which varies from non-caste interactions, not even non-caste, caste interaction between domestic worker and the employer. There, the benevolency is probably bordering around kinship, extended family relations and all. That diversity need to be noted if we are talking about low income taking to domestic worker, which is different from the very high income group, which is sort of a class differences, which brings in all these biases in 100%, but there are variation when it comes to employers of this kind. Then the second aspect that I'm thinking about is this gendered nature of employment itself, where we also see the brutalization of interaction between caste of women and class of women, between the domestic worker and the employer. Now this dynamic again provides a response which is beyond benevolency, because here the interdependency as women vis-a-vis, a large number of inactive men. So what we find in the case of Tamil Nadu itself, I mean, one can talk about the welfare politics being put in place in a much systematic way, and strategically it's working out. What is important to note is that the way in which intensity of domesticity, where the entrenchment of women across caste group creates enormous competition among women themselves, which is based on the hierarchy of class and caste and everything. Now, this anxiety about what really women holds as power is borders around the notion of the privacy, the notion of the private, which the state probably does not really want to resolve it. Now, which means it goes beyond the idea of, strategizing for domestic worker, strategizing for even, the domesticity itself becomes a very important thing for a state like Tamil Nadu. I think this is largely a political context as well. So this is what
I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's exactly that fault line that we were trying to navigate, and this is why regulation in this sector is so particular and so difficult, because structurally everything we called for simplicity, non-market inequalities, all of those things you're thinking about, but particularly this question of the formulation of the private space and of domesticity. This market is deeply structured on those lines, and you can read different forms of our data precisely saying this. The fact that unpaid hours remain so high even after hiring paid domestic work is exactly that. It's a notion that women either don't have the ability to renegotiate domesticity, they don't want to renegotiate domesticity. Domesticity is a source of both power as well as capture. Upwardly mobile caste groups, absolutely. That's why that regression model that told us that Dalit households are less likely to hire paid domestic work as income goes up is a really interesting data find to me. It indicates some disruption where there's something changing as low-income Dalit households gain income. They're not easily replicating paid domestic work dynamics. And at a regression model, I can only tell you that there's something to look at. I just don't know what's there. But it's a very interesting finding that we just marked. Yeah.
If there's nobody else, I'd like to raise a few points. And of course, this is the second time I'm hearing the presentation, and it's a lot more food for thought. So thank you, all of you. I first wanted to pick off on this point of food. Right? And I just think it's interesting to think of, and I think Padmaja Barua uses this, right, about the exceptionalism of benevolence in a particular sense. But we don't ever think of the fact that even domestic workers could save time if there were ways in which, instead of replicating tasks in each household, there could be some sort of coming together as well. And I think this is really, the amount of time spent on food preparation really points to the fact that we really need to think about how many items of food we consume, especially as we go up the caste ladder perhaps. The diversity of our diet, to put it in a nice way, but actually the labor that goes into producing those courses of meals and the expectation that stands there, I think is something to really underline. I'm even thinking of maybe we should put a box in our report and talk about some of the food practices in Bangalore and Bengaluru and Chennai from that perspective, right? But also to say that I think the motivation for domestic workers to also take food is because they are also, it's a time-saving, sort of opportunity, because they perhaps don't have to go back and also again cook an extra vegetable or an extra dal back home. So I think it's interesting because I think the point should be that of course leftovers shouldn't be given, but I think in being able to share food, share utensils, there are opportunities of again expressing solidarity between employers and domestic workers. The second point I just wanted to raise was about care, and I think that's what's phenomenal about this report, is that actually women have more opportunities of going into paid work perhaps if their care responsibilities are taken care of, right? And I think that's a really, really important thing for all of us to reflect upon, which then brings us to the need for socialization of care. To have those opportunities across classes. This is something that, of course, we're dealing with Anganwadi workers and Asha workers being treated as quote-unquote volunteers, right? And the undermining of their labor there. But the fact that you really don't have any system that can cater to especially low-income households if they have care requirements with under 5 children, for example, right? Or elderly care for that matter. So I think this idea of thinking then about, in addition to, of course, organizing and collectively looking at what kind of bargaining rights we need to actually look at, also think of the infrastructure and again, I think, Gautam, we have much to talk about in terms of where you want to pitch policy. I may not completely agree, and I think that this calls for a longer discussion. But really, in that ward or in that municipality, are we then also going to think of the number of creches that are required, not just by the population that lives there, but also by the worker population that actually services that area, right? That's really important too. One point just on methods, because I think, and again, hats off to the entire team for, I know the refusal rates, and it's been really, really challenging to speak to employers. But I think it's also interesting to think of how we are unable to triangulate some of these findings, right? And which is why there needs to be then perhaps this conversation where we take these learnings, of course, to trade unions. But I also, in yesterday's discussion at BTS, I was just thinking that a lot of the times, especially when it comes to discrimination or the workplace violations that workers face, we always start with trying to get the worker to narrate her experience. And while it might be cathartic, I think it can also be discriminatory in the way and manner in which that interaction takes place, right? So then to think about whether we can use some statements made by employers or results that we find from this survey to pose as a statement and then see what domestic workers feel. And I think that again is perhaps the next step, right? In terms of seeing that we now have a survey of employers. What do we make out of it when we take these findings to trade unions and to members of trade unions? And I think that in itself would be an interesting study to think about. And finally, if I may just say this, I think it's been a great opportunity to see also how sampling can be done in cities, but also I think the identification of different income households. And I think it's been quite amazing the way IIHS has done this. So also I think for trade unions it might be useful to reach out to IIHS and ask them for a mapping of these cities so that unions can then layer where their branch offices and their unit offices are and see which set of rights they want to bargain for based on an area or a specific ward, which might be targeted. And like Sujata was saying, right, in some places the bonus has come through, in some places it's not. And perhaps this overlay, right, of looking at different incomes with densities of population and household types with the presence of unions and the strength that you have can actually, I think, give us a really interesting perspective on what really needs to be done in terms of strategizing, much more sort of, not in a generic way, but trying to sort of, strategize in a much more nuanced fashion, perhaps, based on different areas within the same city. Thank you.
I think that's a lovely note to bring us to 5:30 in our time. But all of those, we would love to do all of those things. So we'll be in touch with all the partners here and spend more time. IIHS has an office in Chennai. We have a lot of people here. So we will be able to come and sit and come meet you calmly and slowly and talk about the results and get your opinion. So we'll be sure to come back. And thank you so much for your time and attention today.